Ask yourself, what is the radio good for? The radio is good for taking somebody else's experience and making you understand what it would be like. Because when you don't see someone, but you hear them talking, that is what radio is all about. It's like when seeing someone is talking from the heart. Everything about it conspires to take you into somebody else's world.
There's an episode of This American Life titled Save the Girl. Released on July 12, 2019, it's the 679th episode of the long-running radio program podcast Hybrid, and features 2 acts, much like many other episodes of the show. In Act 1, producer Nadia Raymond narrates the infuriating story of Young Shong, a 19-year-old woman immigrating to the United States from Laos to meet her fiancé. At the customs desk, Young is questioned about her birth date because Customs and Border Protection officers, or CBP as I'll refer to them, suspect she's actually a minor being trafficked. This is due both to her unusually young appearance by Western standards, and because photos in Young's luggage seem to show her visibly frightened around her fiancé. She's then subjected to a teeth x-ray, which can be used to determine a person's age within an extremely general range of 5 years or so. The CBP is firm in their conclusion. 19-year-old Yang Shong is a minor and won't be seeing her fiancé anytime soon. She's brought to a juvenile shelter in Chicago where she lives for 14 months. Act 2 revolves around the 7.1 magnitude earthquake that decimated parts of Mexico on September 19, 2017. In it, a 12-year-old girl named Frida Sofia is seemingly discovered stuck beneath the rubble of her collapsed school by rescuers. You might know how the story goes. The media machine surrounding it captivated the world. Well, for a day, that is. Spoilers, the story was BS. There was no Frida. Workers claimed that they were hearing her say things that were never said. When the truth came out, many claimed that Televisa, one of the media companies covering the story, had fabricated the story for views. But the reality was far more complicated. See, the point of Save the Girl is that both of these stories became stories in the first place because people love happy endings, and they love to be the hero that gets to write that story as they see fit. In Young's case, the CBP wanted to protect an adult who they thought was a child from a perceived trafficker who, it turns out, really was just her fiancé. And even when the CBP were proven wrong, their shelter release materials marked her as a 15-year-old. Her release conditions demanded that she live as a minor with her aunt. For years, she attended high school, wearing clothes that were too small, being taught subjects she already knew, and reliving parts of growing up that she'd already been through. All because somebody had to go and be a hero in her story. Stories aren't about winners and losers, but if you choose to see them that way, it's clear the CBP comes out on top here at the expense of Young's personhood. In the case of the Mexican earthquake, rescuers, media, and a captivated audience of millions simply wanted to believe that there really was a young girl to save. And can you blame them? Here's a country reeling after a natural disaster that claimed the lives of 370 people, including multiple children, and left over 6,000 more injured. Why wouldn't you want someone to save? Both Acts 1 and 2 are stories of savior complexes. Complexes that are innate to human nature, yet are the result of a distinctly masculine cultural project throughout centuries of human history. This American Life host Ira Glass connects these damsels in distress stories to a lecture given by acclaimed novelist Kurt Vonnegut on popular story structure. In it, Vonnegut uses the story of Cinderella to claim that the kinds of stories that resonate most with Western audiences are those where a gentle, kind-hearted character, notably a female, gentle, kind-hearted character, starts at a dire point in her life where she's as far away from something good happening to her as possible. She toils until a suave, confident man comes along to show her a good time and brighten her spirits. So when misfortune strikes again, she doesn't end up right back where she started because now she has a hopeful memory to cling to. An aspiration. A light at the end of the tunnel. And, in the fashion of classical story structures, the savior does ultimately return to deliver our woman protagonist from a life of sadness and hardship to one of infinite bliss, paradise everlasting. In recounting the Vonnegut lecture, Glass argues that this story structure that manifests itself throughout cultural history is what influences our subconscious desire for there to be a girl to save. Undoubtedly, this reflects in the stories that influence it are driven by the long-standing social bias that young girls and women are fragile objects of desire for young boys and men to win the admiration, affection, and possession of. This attitude, which, yes, influences women too, asserts that quote-unquote females are to be saved at all cost, even when that means protecting them from their own decisions. It flattens the complexity of a person down to a fairy tale archetype that's essentially been retold in countless stories for millennium by adults who wrongly believe that their children audiences are incapable of comprehending stories informed by a more nuanced worldview, with characters that don't conform to heteronormative traits and who are driven by moral compasses that are less black and white. Save the Girl's point is simple. The damsel in distress trope is a cultural disease to be purged, not a lens to view others through. Let's pause for a second, since if you've heard Save the Girl before, or are just an avid listener of This American Life, you know that I've actually been keeping a pretty important part of this episode's overall narrative from you. The prologue. See, every episode of This American Life opens with a pithy aside that sort of sets the table for the longer form stories to come. And episode 679's prologue kind of drives me up the wall. I have examples, real life examples. Stay with me.
Shall we mosey on over?
Let's.
So, right off the bat, Ira Glass, who, by the way, was 60 years old when this episode released, opens with a very strange generalization about teenage boys when he says, quote, "Of everything in pop culture, what can make a teenage boy cry?" That's a very specialized list, right? Probably not. Boys and men cry. They do that. We do that. And like, whether you're a boy, a girl, or anything in between, during your teenage years, especially those following puberty, you tend to feel particularly vivid emotions, both positive and negative, extremely often. So, most any works of fiction that features a sad moment and is simple enough to understand for a teenage boy could very well turn on the waterworks. It's why the art we consume during this period of our lives tends to be so formative to our overall sensibilities as we move forward in life. Glass is attempting to establish this idea that within the landscape of popular culture, there are certain things that are so bereft of nuance and depth that they could only stand a chance of emotionally influencing a person that isn't yet fully formed. In other words, a child. It's at this point that Glass recalls a story told by This American Life producer Lena Msitzis of a time when her brother and her brother's friends cried as children while playing video game developer Squaresoft's 1997 PlayStation 1 classic, Final Fantasy VII. Specifically, Lena's brother's intense emotional reaction came about due to, spoilers for one of the most famous moments in pop culture history, the murder of party member Aerith Gainsborough by antagonist Sephiroth. Side note, at the time, Aerith's name was erroneously localized as Eris, which is why you see it spelled that way in FF7 footage throughout this video. Glass asks Misitzes what was so intense about Aerith that made people care so much, and she's gobsmacked. She calls Aerith one-dimensional and compares her to a cartoonish Mario character. Quote, "It doesn't make sense to me that all of these boys would cry over it." To try and understand why someone would have this reaction, she phones up Mike Fahey, who wrote for video game publication Kotaku for 16 years until he tragically passed away. Fahey had recently written a piece called I Can't Go Through This Again, Final Fantasy VII, about the May 2019 trailer for the game's pseudo-remake, Final Fantasy VII Remake. In this story, he vividly relives the intense sense of grief he felt in 1997, having experienced Aerith's death firsthand, though admits that maybe that response was overblown given what those characters look like in-game. He posits that perhaps the actual reason people cried at this scene was due to how Aerith's musical theme by composer Nobuo Uematsu is so poignantly deployed. In their conversation, Fahey walks Misitzes through Aerith's death scene as well as, and this is important, his memory of who Aerith was. Quote, "It felt like there was no real lead into it. I might have even had my attention wandering while the cutscene was playing. And then, all of a sudden, there's a giant sword in her. Sephiroth comes down, impales her, and you're like, no, this has to change. This has to stop." My stomach fell. I remember my stomach just falling and feeling like it was just dropping in my chest. And that music kicks in just as she's dying. And whenever I hear that music, I just tear right up. Here, Fahey powerfully contextualizes what many people were feeling at that moment. And so what if a lot of people touched by this scene were kids? After all, children's emotions are just as valid as any adults. And some say that children actually see the truth of things in ways that experienced adults are too preoccupied to. Yet, throughout the prologue of Save the Girl, Misitzes and Glass completely make light of and trivialize what this scene was for millions of boys and girls. One of the many reasons FF7 was so popular in the first place was that it was a game that not just Square, but Sony believed was so pivotal to selling PlayStations in 1997 that they actually published the game worldwide, everywhere except Japan. Meaning that plenty of boys and girls were exposed to this game. Girls liked video games too back then. This isn't a new phenomenon. And mind you, this is a game that prominently featured 2 women and a teenage girl in your party. In 1997, this commitment to making badass female characters who, by the way, are like 80,000 times more competent than the male protagonist, like making them the entire thing for unarguably the biggest blockbuster game release of that year, was basically unheard of. Make no mistake, Final Fantasy VII was never a game for dudes. It was for everyone. Continuing his recollection of the death scene, Fahey makes it to the moments after Sephiroth has removed his blade from Aerith's body. He has another emotional moment when, in agony, Cloud says that, quote, "Aerith will no longer talk, no longer laugh, cry, or get angry. His fingers are tingling, his mouth is dry, his eyes are burning." Glass asks Misitzes why it is that people lose it at this particular depiction of the death of a close friend. She says it's probably because it was one of the first times it happened in games, which isn't true, but it was likely many young people's first encounter with death, fictional or otherwise. At this point, if you had any doubt that Misitzes and Glass have zero interest in researching or offering a good faith reading on this subject, you know, the 2 main reasons for This American Life's existence, what comes next will certainly lay your doubts to rest. Misitzes says, quote, "In the game, she really does just 2 things. She stands next to people and calms them down. Like, she'll put her hand on someone's chest in this meaningful way. She's this reassuring presence, this healer. And then the other thing she does is she asks for help."
So that's the 2 basic female functions, right? It's like, fix and help, fix and help.
Look, I'm not asking for people who aren't interested in games to all of a sudden become experts in them, but like, If you've seen 10 minutes worth of scenes with Aerith from just the original game alone, not even the remake, you would know that this isn't even close to anything resembling a decent portrayal of her character. Aerith is kind of a troublemaker, one who's willing to run away from home and throw herself headlong into danger, but who at all times is also capable of balancing that sort of tenacity with this intense emotional intelligence. Yes, she is a healer, but she's also a fighter, one whose mechanical absence following her death is sorely felt. She's a fully formed person with a deep, tragic backstory, but who doesn't let that get in the way of her wants and desires for the future. Does Aerith do some stereotypically feminine things like grow flowers, heal others, and wear a dress? Sure. But our protagonist Cloud goes against his morosely masculine roots to wear one of Aerith's flowers in front of Tifa, the most badass fighter in a world full of brutish government agents, samurai and shinobi, labor-hardened coal miners, aliens, and even gods. The gruff Barret, who's large as a tank, is practically the group's biggest softie. Dude loves his daughter more than anything. Yuffie is a klutzy tomboy, Sephiroth is a mama's boy, the list goes on. This isn't bell hooks by any stretch, but claiming that Final Fantasy VII's characters only stand to reinforce the gender status quo is just bad reporting. It's bad journalism. It's either an unforced error born from intellectual laziness, or a tacit admission from Glass & Company that they simply didn't have a better third example to complete their structurally required trifecta of thematically related stories. Ironically enough, Glass and Misitsis here use Aerith as a pawn in their narrative project that attempts to liberate an entire gender of people who didn't need saving in the first place. Feihi agrees with Misitsis calling Aerith one-dimensional and compares her to a ray of hope and a billboard that things can be better. Misitsis then asks Feihi if Aerith's death would have been as meaningful if she had served as Cloud's little brother to leave out any room for the game's will they won't they romantics. Feihi speculates that, if that were the case, they would have had to do more personality crafting and make more scenes to make the player care more about that character. I don't disagree that the player is asked to do a bit of reading between the lines to connect with these characters. This was the PS1 after all. Square were figuring out how to make a 3D game and tell a compelling story while fighting up against memory limitations. And while plenty of prior games had in-depth stories, traditional console games still had to conform to market expectations for what games were. It wasn't like today where when you buy a Yakuza or a Kojima game, you pretty much expect to not touch the controller for 20 or more minutes at a time while a sequence of cutscenes plays out. Even if Square had the capability to make extremely long story sequences in their games to enrich their characters, at the end of the day, they were still making video games. Have the player spend too much time away from the other parts of a JRPG's core loop, namely exploration, preparation, and combat, and you risk losing the average player's interest. Square knew this then, and they know it now. Final Fantasy VII Remake expands the original game's 6-hour Midgar section into a nearly 40-hour adventure, partially as an acknowledgement that people just wanted more of these characters. And the game ends with our characters having defeated Destiny itself, giving the next two games in the trilogy a renewed sense of urgency since their fates are no longer bound to what happened in the original game. This has led to an intense volume of speculation about what's going to happen differently going forward. Will Cloud be forced to give Sephiroth the Black Materia? Is the world still going to be overrun by Nanaki things? How do we save Aerith? Can we? This is speculation that wouldn't be happening at all if the original Final Fantasy VII hadn't made people care about these characters from their genesis. With that in mind, can you honestly sit here and tell me that Aerith has less personality than a chocobo? Misitsis says to Glass, quote, "In the game, it's confusing whether or not she's like you, the protagonist's romantic interest, or like your little sister. And I think that that's intentional. Those are the things that it takes for you to feel protective of her." First of all, isn't that ambiguity a good thing? Like, they don't need to explicitly spell out that relationship because it doesn't factor into the story. Plus, it gives the player the opportunity to imagine the subtext of the situation. You know, use their brains. And second, throughout its story, FF7 shows you the traumas and vulnerabilities of the entire party. It wants you to feel protective of everybody, and doesn't just expect that you will right off the bat. Like, they're not real people. They have to do the work to make the audience care. That's like the entire premise of what fiction is. Fahey then says, I think her death makes the stakes real. It's a game up until her death. Then Misiti says, and her death sends them to their actual mission, to save the world. She's just a prop that gets them there. That's her whole function in the game. Okay, yes, Aerith's death does serve a dual purpose of being an escalation device, but like, it's a plot. It has events that serve as catalysts for future events to come. Like, stuff doesn't just happen for no reason. And like, that they already wanted to kill Sephiroth. Like, that already was their goal from the moment they left Midgar. Aerith's death only heightened that rivalry because they really did care about her. Like, they really did. Like, I promise you, people don't cry at made up shit for no reason, you fucking clods. And like, they get so close to getting it too. Like, at one point, Glass remarks, so basically it's like she's this barely filled in character, and yet that's enough to work, to make people have all these feelings to actually cry when she does die. Like, brother, you're right there, dude. Again, they cry because she's not barely filled in. She is filled in. She's a character. Like, if This American Life had just done some modicum of research, like even just gotten one more source, they'd be able to see that there's so many more reasons millions cared about her than the fact that she was the one girl that couldn't be saved. And like, even if I'm wrong and they're right that there aren't any good reasons to care about Aerith, the fact that people care nonetheless is kind of a beautiful testament to like the notion that decent people, and even archetypes of decent people like the one they believe Aerith represents, that these are all things that deserve dignity. And that's something I just don't think these smarmy assholes at This American Life would get. It kind of doesn't matter who the girl really is, or if she wants to get rescued. She's sort of just a girl getting rescued. They don't see what the girl actually wants or needs. They don't see her. Bless his heart, Fahey's fading recollection of Aerith's apparent naivete certainly doesn't help matters. But either way, he's just the interview subject. Save the Girl ultimately isn't his narrative to shape. Here is a journalistic practice seen as respectable by a notably particular demographic of white, middle to upper class liberals that's fundamentally incapable of grasping a simple truth. People care about Aerith's death because they care about Aerith. They care because by the time they make it to that fateful scene, Final Fantasy VII has given them enough characterization, personality, and memorable moments to make Aerith feel like a person they know, whether that's the older, more rigid visual representation of her, or her luxurious visual recreation for Final Fantasy VII Remake. Her death feels like a genuine loss, less so because the RPG party is suddenly without its white mage, and more because powerful artworks almost demand that we connect the tragedies that befall that work's characters to the friends and family we've lost in our own lives. People care about Aerith, not because she was a girl we couldn't save, but because they care about people. They care for each other. And Save the Girl says, you should feel stupid for caring. At the end of the day, This American Life is a business. An episode has to go live every week to keep things rolling. That's capitalism for you. So when they only had 2 stories to pull from, I can kind of see how Misiti's landed on tweaking a memory of her brother crying at a video game into cultural criticism that can fit the mandated Save the Girl theme. But by situating this shallow critique of a video game as the framing device for this particular episode, This American Life coldly converts a beautiful experience shared by millions into a cheap shot at people they perceive as emotionally stunted. Worse yet, they belittle the horrors a woman suffered in immigrating to America and make light of the collective grief a country was forced to work through before an audience of millions. At best, Save the Girl is irresponsible journalism, and at worst, it's an abject rejection of humanity. So why do I care so much about what ultimately amounts to a throwaway anecdote at the top of a 4-year-old podcast? I suppose it's because, to me, Save the Girl serves as a reminder of the responsibility critics should adhere to and respect. After all, the ways we talk about works of art are just as much a reflection of the human experience and condition as the works themselves. And I believe our critical analysis, whether positive or negative, cultural or sociological, should serve the purpose of exposing and interrogating that work's true nature, rather than any false perceptions we fabricated from the ignorance of disinterest. I guess I hope with this video that I can help more people do just that. Thanks for watching.
You have to ask yourself, what is the radio good for? The radio is good for taking somebody else's experience and making you understand what it would be like. Because when you don't see someone, but you hear them talking, and that is what radio is all about, it's like when someone is talking from the heart. Everything about it conspires to take you into somebody else's world.
Ira Glass, Chicago Magazine. Also, like, isn't being rescued at the cost of stumbling into a traditional gender role preferable to, like, dying? I mean, I know Aerith has to die to return to the live stream and all that, but, like, at the end of the day, her story is distinct from Young Shang's in that if Aerith could help it, I feel like she almost certainly would have preferred to have been saved by Cloud and the rest of the gang instead of being stabbed through the back, right? Is that bad for me to assume? I mean, I feel like being stabbed through the back by a big-ass sword probably hurts a lot more than like, oh no, I did a gender role. You know, if I'm ever in Aerith's position, please feel free. I give you my permission to save me and then subsequently call me a wimp for being powerless to prevent Sephiroth, who's like basically a living god, from stabbing me through the back, because I would much prefer that fate over, you know, being stabbed through the back with a giant sword. Goodbye.